Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. With energy prices rising globally, inflation skyrocketing, and the expensive winter heating season upon us, for many of you, the last thing on your mind is climate change. But that is exactly what has been on the mind of many global leaders as they recently wrapped up the 27th UN Conference on Climate Change, known as COP27. Yes, global leaders, climate activists, and even celebrities descended upon the Egyptian coastal resort town of Sharm el-Sheikh for the conference to hash out new policies, new programs, and new commitments. So what exactly was committed to and by whom? What did Canada have to say at COP27? Are Canadians doing enough, paying enough with rising carbon taxes? When some families have concerns about making ends meet and paying their mortgages with higher interest rates looming, is this the time for Canada to be focusing on climate actions? And is any of this actually accomplishing the stated goal to slow global warming? Well, joining me now is Dan McTeague, president of Canadians for Affordable Energy. Dan, thanks for coming on today. So please tell us what happened at COP27. It recently wrapped up at that luxury seaside resort. What exactly was achieved at this conference?
Well, I think 800 jets came in and flew out to a nice little area of the world that not many people have access to. I know a little bit about the place in my old days in foreign affairs, and it certainly is quite the Tony location to be, standing on your pulpit and, of course, lecturing the world on how they're doing bad things. I think the irony was obviously in the visuals, which was why do you need to be there? You could have chosen any other place on the continent of Africa, which of course is preparing itself to try to catch up to the rest of the world. And to do so, they're not going to be doing it with solar panels and windmills. They're going to be doing it with fossil fuels, hydrocarbons such as oil and gas. But the agenda obviously was one of the same. It's as if the world hasn't changed. It's as if we haven't had an invasion in Europe. It's as if we haven't seen a recovery from COVID, demand shooting up and supply simply not being there. It's as if we've completely ignored the inflationary effects of all of these things. And we've, again, thought that there's really no consequence here other than to come back and say, well, we have to agree that we have to do everything we can to prevent temperatures from rising 1.5 degrees.
Right.
I think there comes a point when you do these things every year, and it's always a last minute rush to the end. And then, of course, a major, massive commitment of monies to parts of the world that believe that they're getting the short end of the stick, that you have to start to really call these things for what they are. An exercise in baffle gab with a bunch of people gathering, swilling back Perrier, eating canapes, while the rest of the world has to deal with the bitter reality of energy scarcity.
And apparently a lot of them in some uber air-conditioned facilities. I heard the air conditioning was jacked up so high, it was actually quite cold for a lot of these delegates, wanting to reduce the world's temperature by 1.5 degrees. It sounded like what you were suggesting is there was almost a tone deafness. And you're right, there have been some massive international issues. Obviously, energy prices around the world are skyrocketing. It does sound, when a certain global elites, if you will, and the global leaders gather, that there is a tone deafness when we're worried about one thing, but the rest of us are wondering, how are we going to access energy if you're in Europe, and what cost will that come at? One thing that did come out, and you did hint at it, was climate reparations. This is the first time I've ever heard of climate reparations. Could you explain what this is and how you think this will be rolled out?
Well, the idea is, of course, damage to the environment, but also that there are nations which have never been able to take advantage of hydrocarbons, the benefits, the improvements in agricultural output, the improvements in the quality of life, the ability for us to pretty much produce everything and anything that shows why the world population has increased and has done so with lowering mortality rates. And despite some bad weather from time to time, being able to manage those and to adapt. But yes, the idea was to somehow penalize parts of the world that have done very well by the use of hydrocarbons, responsible as they are, especially a country like Canada, and as it were, to pay some form of reparations to parts of the world that have not been able to enjoy quite the same benefit. It's actually a little ironic rather than promoting the idea of getting hydrocarbons like natural gas and nuclear. Well, that's of course not a hydrocarbon, but getting higher, newer technologies that have advantaged the world to those parts of the world that have never been able to really benefit from them. We're instead saying pay as you go, and pay some people some money so that at the end of the day we give this sort of idea that we've paid penance for something that that we've done.
Welcome back. We're getting an energy update, finding out what's happening in the world and specifically in Canada, especially on the heels of COP27, the UN climate change conference that occurred just recently in Egypt. Dan, before commercial, we were talking about climate reparations and the suggestion that some of these developed nations would then pay some of the developing nations some form of money, it sounds like, we don't know specifically, some money to offset that they haven't been able to invest in, say, some of these more green energy alternatives. Is there, how will this be hashed out? Is there an actual framework to get this money to these countries? Like, what can we expect?
There is a framework.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Tanya, there is a framework, but the framework isn't well defined, and it's to pay reparations for what? For being successful, for being able to provide the same kind of technologies that they could take advantage of, especially in places like Africa, where there's an abundance of hydrocarbons for which it's not been properly exploited. There's a lot to unpack there, certainly on the humanitarian side and on the political governance side, but in terms of simply, issuing a check. I'm sure in an environment where there is plenty of money going out the window, especially to pay for, energy costs in Europe, that this is just not something that's salvageable or even contemplatable. And, now that COP27 is behind us, I don't think anyone's going to talk about it seriously for the foreseeable future.
Okay, brings me to my next question. If so little is achieved at these conferences, which sounds like that's what you're suggesting, and there are vague commitments made that may not come to fruition, then why all the effort and attention for a conference like this?
It's almost habitual. And over the past 20 or 30 years, we've become accustomed to covering these things a month before and perhaps as much as a month after. So we spend a third of the year talking about these things as if they are, etched in stone. I think the world understands the responsibility. Canada certainly understands that in terms of its environmental standards, ESG standards, how it manages its energy, which happens to be arguably the best in the world. But beyond that, I think it does suggest that maybe it is, call it for what it is. Opinion leaders, elites, what I would think, of course, is legacy media, not able to change the focus onto things that really matter to people, being able to make ends meet, the concern about the geopolitical strains in the world. And for us here in Canada, having the third largest provable reserves in the world, watching a world now really at the beck and call and at the mercy of a country that has the eighth largest provable reserves in the world, Russia, as it continues its geopolitical mayhem throughout Europe, which has implications for the entire world.
Well, let's talk about those implications. What do you anticipate our winter will look like, given the political dynamic between Russia and what's going on in Ukraine, and with the pipeline disruptions? What do you see? What will Canadians' winter look like?
Well, Tanya, I think we got a sample of that a couple of weeks ago before the world started focusing on COVID lockdowns in China. And of course, what is happening now with what appears to be a world on edge, watching what might take place in terms of the continuation, the frustration of the Chinese people towards their authoritarian government. I think for Canadians, looking at record prices for diesel, the fuel that runs the global economy. It's not windmills and solar panels and electric vehicles. It is in fact diesel, and of course the price of diesel has hit all-time highs. Now, while it has come down a little bit, there's no doubt that we're going to see a winter as it gets colder, where shortage in supplies of natural gas in parts of the world, especially Europe, diesel and shorter supplies result in refinery closures in the United States, an administration in the United States, the Biden administration attacking fossil fuels. We are going to see much higher prices, including a weak Canadian dollar, which is leading to much disruption in terms of our ability to make ends meet. We're seeing that out in the Atlantic coast. For the government now to say, well, that's not important, we have to deal with a bevy of new carbon taxes, shows not just how tone deaf they are, but how out of step they are with the reality that most Canadians are suffering or confronting as we head into this cold winter.
And I want to unpack that more in our next segment. We have about a minute before commercial. I want to talk about Germany for a second. You read headlines in global papers and magazines saying that Germany's going to freeze this winter. What are they meaning by that? What are they suggesting?
Well, Germany, unless it's prepared to, kick into high gear coal, which it's doing now, it's using more coal than any time in its history. There is no more natural gas. Germany put all its eggs in one basket, assuming that winds would blow and that the sun would shine and you would have plenty of renewable resources. And where, of course, you were short on those particular products, where those things failed, you could always rely on Russia. The so-called energy event, policies that were created during the time of Merkel and her predecessor.
Right.
So at the end of the day, real problems for Germany, a contradiction, and it's likely to lead to very, very cold days ahead for that country.
My goodness. Okay, we're going to unpack more about what this means for Canada in the next segment. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're joined by Dan McTeague, president of Canadians for Affordable Energy, to discuss Canada and energy and what should be happening and what isn't happening and perhaps what we're not doing well. Let's talk about money because, that's a huge issue. We all pay dollars. We all pay carbon taxes. Where is this money going? Well, since 2015, and I believe I pulled this from one of your studies, Dan, Trudeau has spent $60 billion, that's Prime Minister Trudeau, trying to get our global greenhouse emissions even lower. So they're around 1.5%, trying to reduce them even further. That's a lot of money. In the grand scheme of things, maybe not, but that to me seems like a lot of money. And now when we may have signed on to climate reparations, we will be paying even more. Is this reasonable?
Well, it's not reasonable, and it's a drop in the bucket compared to what the Trudeau government and their defenders, part of their coalition, the NDP and the Greens and the Bloc, have intended. They are looking at about a $2 trillion investment to provide net zero electrification by 2030 and 2050. I see those two dates because there's a number of steps in between. And to get there, they're going to have to spend a lot of money on the grids in this province and in this country. And to do that, they're going to have to obviously go to the public, to the well several times in order to pay for that. I don't think the public is aware of the implications, but they're starting to see it in terms of the electrical bills, which, as you know, in this province, with the first really genesis of all these energy ideas began with the 2010 Green Energy Act here in the province of Ontario, where your hydro rates have doubled since then.
Yes.
And it would have tripled were it not for the fact that the province of Ontario is absorbing a $7 billion debt just to pay to defend people from the full ravages of that policy. The reality is it's going to go much higher, and the federal government needs to find finances for it. Part of that, of course, is coming from carbon taxes, because as we know, they are not net neutral. They are certainly to the advantage of the government. It's a form of wealth distribution,
yes,
but also an opportunity for green initiatives, and a lot of grifters making a lot of money.
That's for certain. I know you've mentioned on our show previously about the second carbon tax. It's not exactly named that. It's the Clean Fuel Standard. Could you explain how that will impact Canadian households and what exactly it is?
So we've completed a study with Ross McKittrick not too long ago in which we quantified the effect on the Canadian economy, a loss of about $70 billion in economic activity, a loss of about 1.2% in GDP. That's your entire economic outlook. The Clean Fuel Standard is really another attempt at trying to bring emissions down, focusing almost exclusively on refineries, on diesel and on gasoline. We had first said that it was wrong to do it to natural gas and to heating fuels, particularly given that people needed to survive. Apparently, the government agreed with that. Certainly, the maritime provinces saw that first study, agreed with it. But it still continues the federal government down the road of not having just one carbon tax, but now a host of regulations that constitute a second carbon tax. And if you speak, Tanya, to any environmental economist, a climate economist, William Nordhaus in particular, that's the sort of the one that everyone goes to. He's very clear. You do not complicate the existing carbon tax with other regulations that distort price discovery and, of course, the importance of the first one in terms of getting people to curb their behaviors. So here you have a federal government not just doubling down on a clean fuel standard, not just regulating the industry. Now, of course, even talking about emission caps, which I'll be working on over the next couple of weeks with yet another blog. We are setting ourselves up to be cute and trendy, and it's going to hurt the Canadian economy. Deindustrialization, a dramatic drop in our standard of living, and of course, energy costs that most of us cannot afford.
Well, I certainly hope that Canadian families won't be bankrupted for the sake of wokeness. That would be really, really unfortunate. Another about the clean fuel standard, again, I pulled this from one of your articles. It said it would increase household energy costs by 2.2% to 6.5%, meaning it will add an extra about $1,200, $1,300 per year per worker. That's a lot.
That's right. So if you think about it, you have two people working in a family, it's an extra $2,500 a year. That's on top of the existing carbon tax, which the parliamentary budget officer has said will not be completely rebated. It means a decline in investments in Canada. It means a decline in our economic activity. And at the end of the day, the kicker is we won't reduce in any way, shape, or form emissions. Because part of the reason we're going to use the clean fuel standard is by buying more ethanol, much of that from the United States, produced by coal and products that are not necessarily emissions friendly. Therefore, there will be, all we're basically doing is offloading our emissions numbers, getting our friends in the United States to increase theirs. At the end of the day, we're doing nothing for the environment. So it is, again, window dressing at an extraordinarily high price that I think most Canadians are unaware of. They're starting to see it in grocery stores. Right. They're starting to see it in terms of winter costs for their natural gas and for the heating. To use an old expression, you ain't seen nothing yet.
Welcome back. We're picking up our discussion with Dan McTeague, president of Canadians for Affordable Energy, and we're discussing energy and Canada's energy needs and what we're doing to fight global climate change, or at least that's what they're suggesting we're doing. When in fact it sounds like, based on our conversation so far, we're spending billions of dollars amounting to very little change, which is shocking to maybe some of our viewers. Let's talk about Ontario for a moment. So in August, the Ontario Energy Minister, Todd Smith, he asked the Independent Electric System Operator, IESO, to report on exploring a moratorium on natural gas for power generation. So that shocked me when I read that statement. But explain to me, how would a moratorium on natural gas impact Ontarians?
Blackouts. You like what you saw in California? That's exactly what would happen here. We just look at the fact that in Ontario, we do see growth in population, the expansion of our electrical grid. It can't be supported unless you're prepared to build a few nuclear plants, which take years to do. Technology around, small modular reactors are many years away, although they show signs of promise. This is really a reaction to municipalities being conned into this idea that you can somehow do away with natural gas as backup, while nuclear plants, like the ones, for instance, in my old riding in Pickering, have systematically seen their closure. Now, the government has given a moratorium. They're going to allow it to go a little longer, particularly the Pickering B units that could keep the systems going for a little longer. But at the end of the day, it's natural gas, which is the backup for a lot of these plants that we see right across Ontario, and they provide reliable energy. Municipalities, some of them have come out and said, well, there's this climate emergency. The world is coming to an end. The sky is falling. And what they're saying is we need to get rid of natural gas. If you do that, you have no alternatives. Quebec cannot provide the base load, especially in the dead of winter, when Ontario actually exports its energy, a lot of its electricity, to Quebec. So unfortunately for the minister, and for Ontario, they've gone down this road of saying what will happen. Ask the IESO. They came back and said, it's blackout city at prices you can't afford.
Wow. So at least somebody has some reason here in this big framework. And correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't the wind turbines, the large windmills, aren't they also gas backed up?
They have to be. I mean, people say it doesn't cost much to create them, but they're kind of useless unless you have some kind of battery storage or some kind of natural gas backup. Battery storage is in its infancy, and it's not very reliable, especially in cold weather. Ask somebody who drives a hybrid vehicle how their battery is performing as the temperature drops. But I digress. The reality is that we're going to need natural gas, a lot more of it. The idea that Todd Smith, the Minister of Energy, put forward was both premature and perhaps an attempt to try to mollify and placate a constituency of green fanatics who will never support the Conservative Party, much less his policies.
Now, we talk about green vehicles or the electric vehicles. I'm always concerned that with the amount of incentives to procure and to obtain and to purchase electric vehicles going around in North America, that we really are overloading our grid. And to hear that there's potential interest in shutting down natural gas, we're really putting a lot of eggs in one basket on electricity. Is our system, in Ontario and Canada, are we built to accommodate this large insurgence of electric vehicles?
Well, no. And we got to remind ourselves that electric vehicles can't be built without diesel and gasoline and natural gas to be processed. But more than that, the electrical grid isn't ready, and it's going to take trillions of dollars, as we said at the outset, in order to accommodate these utopic pie in the sky ideas. It would be a wonderful thing to talk about. But at the end of the day, if your batteries are still being made in China and that the average vehicle takes 100,000 kilometers in EV before it becomes, if you call it emissions equivalent to the latest internal combustion engines, you got to ask yourself, what is this for? Is this really to be trendy, to be cute? Or is it really because you have a practical policy at mind? Most importantly for Ontario, we don't have a lot of oil in our backyard. We don't have a lot of resources. We have a lot in the northern certain parts of the country, but we are looking at a potential for deindustrialization on a scale that we've never seen in Ontario. And that is something I think most Ontarians need to wake up and recognize, because we have a damn good system going here. Long before it was cute, we had nuclear, we had hydro. We should continue to focus on those things as they become realistic and as we have the opportunity to exploit them.
Oh, and on that words, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much again, Dan McTeague, for all of your insights. I think we've covered a whole plethora of issues on this show. But again, Canadians want to know what lies ahead, and I think you really framed it well. Thanks again.
Grateful for this, Tanya. Thank you.
Well, if the government has already spent $60 billion to try to tackle what they see as a really big problem, and again, that's global warming and reducing the heating of the world by 1.5%, and if we've spent that much money and nothing has been accomplished so far, perhaps the questions that need to be asked are, what then should our federal government be doing in this department? For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.